All right, everyone, we should be ready to get started.
Okay, thanks, Cody. How's everyone doing?
Nathan, you're a black hole and not for. Oh, we're live. I won't make jokes about Nathan.
Yeah, I'm not sure why my camera's not working.
What happened to my camera? I can see you, but you cannot see me.
I think you have the blur
Same
on your
with me.
camera. Do you have a privacy thing on your camera to like stop the CIA from spying on you?
Not at all.
Well, you probably
Okay.
should, given your line of work. But
Okay, so we are actually live right now. We're going to work out Stefania's technical issues here on the fly. We're going to get Nathan to come back in. I think anyone who's been following what the American government has been doing for a decade and a half now would find it amusing that we are having such trouble as we try to talk about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But anyway, welcome to everyone who is joining us today. I'm Matt Ho. I'll be moderating this panel discussion. Certainly, what a week it has been. We're here to celebrate and discuss not just the past week, but the last 14 years. I mean, depends on when you want to start this. We can go back to 2006 when Julian Assange begins WikiLeaks. But we're here to celebrate and discuss. Certainly, there is so much to say. And what we're going to do here today is we're going to focus on journalism. There's so many parts, there's so many components that we could have a conversation on about the entirety of this case. But today we're going to focus on the journalism that exposed the truth of what was going on with the U.S. government's persecution, prosecution, and punishment of Julian. So, I mean, you can kind of look at it this way. The overall story here is about truth-telling. It's about Julian Assange exposing the crimes of the American empire. And today we're going to talk about the journalists who exposed the crimes of the American empire in their prosecution and persecution of Julian. So we'll get right to it. We've got four fantastic panelists. We could spend, an hour with each would not be enough. We could spend a whole day with each. But I want to introduce them to you all. I'm sure actually most of you know them. So really is an aspect here if you don't need introductions, but we're going to do so anyway. So Chip Gibbons is the policy director of Defending Rights and Dissent, where he has advised multiple congressional offices on reforming the Espionage Act. He covered Assange's extradition for Jacobin magazine. He is currently working on a book on the history of FBI political surveillance for Verso Books. Kevin Gosztola is the author of Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. He is also the editor of the newsletter The Dissenter at thedissenter.org, which covers whistleblowers, press freedom, and government secrecy. Stefania Maurici is an investigative journalist working for the major Italian daily Il Fatto Quotidiano. Among the international journalists, she is the only one who has worked on all WikiLeaks secret documents and has been engaged in a 9-year-old FOIA battle to defend the right of the press to access the full documentation on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Of course, her book is Secret Power, WikiLeaks, and Its Enemies. And then Nathan Fuller is the executive director of Assange Defense, the U.S.-based campaign to free Julian Assange, and a project of the Courage Foundation, an international whistleblower and journalist support network. All right, thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. This is meant first and foremost of a celebration for Julian Assange, for his family, for all that people like you and so many millions of others have been working for so long. So I just want to open this by each of you all taking 2 or 3 minutes and just basically saying what you're feeling in this moment, what this last week has been like for you. So we'll start with Chip, please.
I was muted. Yeah, so I just want to first start off by saying this is an amazing panel to be part of, and I am so privileged to be part of it. Like, Matt, I remember reading your resignation letter in my college dorm room. I remember watching the Collateral Murder video on Democracy Now! And to have gone from that role and like breaking stories on Democracy Now! About it. Can Kevin and Stefania, you are the two journalists I rely on when I have a question with the factual record. Nate, you are an unsung hero. You have done so much for so long, and I do not envy your job. I don't think you could pay me to do what you did. But I know a lot of this behind the scenes, and you haven't always been appreciated, but all of us appreciate you. And then Kerry Shankman isn't on this panel. He claimed he might listen. He is the espionage expert that I turn to when I, as an espionage expert, have a question. So I want to give him a shout out because he belongs in the same category as Kevin, Stefania, Matt, and Nathan. I was at the October 21 hearing virtually, as was Kevin and Stefania, where Julian Assange was so sick. And we had a conversation like this, Kevin, Stefania, and Ryan Grimm and I afterwards, and we were all horrified by how sickly he looked. And 2 months later, we learned he had a stroke. So I was on the virtual hearing where Julian was sitting there having just had a mini stroke. When I was at the courthouse in February with Stefania, they had an iron cage in the courtroom for him, but he wasn't in it because he had broken his ribs and were too sick to come. And again, we knew about this CIA plot to kill and kidnap him, but part of the plot was if Julian Assange ever got to the airport and boarded a plane at Heathrow, the CIA would have snipers at the airport, great plot that would probably have no collateral damage at all, and would fire sniper rifles to hit the wheels of the. Somebody watched Rambo too many times, and because you were gonna, and to know that they were that know that I didn't know if he was going to live to the end of the UK proceedings, nonetheless survive an extradition, to know that he has been tortured, arbitrarily detained, lawfully detained, but I would dispute the lawfulness of that detention, that they were willing to shoot his plane, to stage a car crash, to prevent him from ever getting to an airport, to turn on the internet, the TV, and see him healthy, looking very healthy, no shackles, no handcuffs, walking onto the plane with Jen Robinson and Barry Pollock, and then landing eventually in Australia and seeing John and Stella, John Shipping's father, and Stella Assange, I've had the privilege of getting to know, greet him on the tarmac. And even the New York Times, which is still doing this mealy mouth backbiting at him, even after he's free, even they had to say he got a hero's welcome. And, you know, to see that moment, it brought tears to my eyes. It was
right.
just
I think it's overwhelming.
It
is. The whole magnitude of this, how historic it was, but the magnitude just, you know, Kevin, how about yourself? This last week, how's it been for you? Because this is something that you have essentially built your career around.
The first journalism that I could truly claim to be doing, although I was covering anti-war protests in Chicago while I was in college, but as I describe in my book, I benefited directly from covering documents that WikiLeaks published. I built my independent journalism career off of describing things in the cables that the New York Times and the Washington Post and other organizations had ignored and decided that this was boring. They weren't interested. It wasn't as salacious as Silvio Berlusconi's bunga bunga parties and stuff like that. So yeah, this has been really remarkable. Obviously, it's cliche. It's very easy in these times to say things like surreal because you kind of wonder, is this actually happened? Did Julian Assange step out of prison and he's no longer being slowly killed by the U.S. national security state? But also, it's a testament to what we do. And I think it affirms what I had been saying all along when I spoke to people who were despondent. As I said, you don't know what it's going to be that will free Julian Assange, because that was the lesson I took away from the freeing of Chelsea Manning by Barack Obama, who showed some mercy and commuted her sentence in military prison. And that wasn't just because Barack Obama was doing that out of the goodness of his heart. It was because there were people who were part of the LGBTQ plus community that had her back as a trans military prisoner in Fort Leavenworth. And then they were maybe sympathetic to why she had blown the whistle and exposed these documents to WikiLeaks, but they stood up for her as humanitarians. And there were people all around the world, as you just described, Chip, the health issues that Julian Assange suffered, that were standing up for him. Because from a humanitarian standpoint, even if you didn't like what he had done, and I hate saying that because I feel like that minimizes what WikiLeaks has contributed to our global knowledge, but he had already served longer than what you would typically serve if you were convicted of an Espionage Act charge and go to prison. And so then it was like, well, how much more do you want, U.S. national security state? Because he has been punished. The process is the punishment. So I just say that looking at all of this, it really hit home for me how this global movement had achieved such a success, because all of these campaigners, like what Nathan Fuller had been organizing, and sometimes it's a little bit like herding cats, but trying to bring people together so that you could effectively take on this case. The human rights organizations, the civil liberties organizations that Chip's a part of, the journalist unions in Europe, the people in Latin America, these leaders, Australia playing a critical role in opening space for this. All of that, it just really hit home for me, the power of this global movement.
Yeah, I think for that, the personal connection we all had here was magnified by the collective involvement, right? We were so tied together in this with so many people, so many organizations. And Stefania, you've been involved with this. This has been your life for the last 15 years. Is that fair to say? How are you feeling this past week?
Yes. So I couldn't believe. I cried so much, I have to say. I was very emotional. I cried so much for hours. And I cried. I couldn't believe he was finally out of the prison. I couldn't believe, he could breathe. He could feel sun on his skin. I couldn't believe it. And I have dedicated so much energy, so much work to achieve this for him and for everyone, for all of us, basically, because this is not just about him. This is about all of us. And I remember how, it was like when you see everything in a few seconds, you see the old saga, 15 years long saga, and you see how it has been, how hard it has been, how difficult, how much it took, how many people, the struggle of, tens of thousands and dozens, hundreds of journalists, lawyers. And at the end of the day, we did overcome. Right. This time we can say, this morning I wrote Ken Loach, who authored the foreword to my book. And I wrote to him, for once we can say we did overcome, not we shall overcome one day, but we did overcome, we did it. It was a collective endeavor, and I think we should be proud and we should be aware of the tremendous effort it took. And it should be, we should be aware of the price he has paid. He has paid an immense price that no one should pay. No one. It is unbearable price. It is unbearable.
And we're going to get to that. Certainly want to speak to you about that. But Nathan, in your comments there, Stefania, about the emotion in all of this, I certainly. I mean, come on, when Julian and I'm getting a little choked up right now when he embraced and kissed Stella and then he hugged his father. I mean, if I'll leave it at that. I think we all know what I'm trying to say. Nathan, for you, how's this last week been, man?
That was just such an incredible moment. Yeah, I've had kind of a similar life trajectory to several of you guys, but definitely matches a lot to Kevin, what he was talking about. We both, my first job out of college was for the Chelsea Manning Support Network. And so this case has been occupying my brain and body and soul for the last 14 years, just like it has you guys. And I'm so happy to be on a panel with you guys smiling and not just talking about the latest legal setback or like, how is his health? We haven't heard from him in a while. A lot of people really worried about him constantly. And it's so moving, as you say, to see him just upright and hugging people and moving on his own. And it's just, the whole thing is just incredibly moving. So yeah, I'm here to represent the activist side of it today. I did journalism covering the court case, but I also was kind of constantly trying to figure out how to spread the word, how to get that next step, make a splash in the media. What is it, that PR thing that's going to make or break the next news cycle? Activists were meeting constantly, brainstorming, coming up with new ideas on limited resources. Trying every different angle that they possibly could think of. And I was trying to herd some cats for sure, but shepherd those in the right direction and make sure we're at the right target. And it took a long time. The work of campaigning is to figure out who is making these decisions really behind the scenes, and how do we get to those people, and what newspapers are they reading, that kind of thing. There's a lot of that kind of work that you don't really see tangibly, but that's always going on behind the scenes. And it's been an incredibly long and widespread fight. I just published a little piece at AssangeDefense.org today just to talk about the global movement, and to say Assange Defense was just one but a part of that. Right. We had incredible people. There were movements in Australia, the UK, across Europe, Latin America. One thing that strikes me is we've been a long time fighting for his freedom since the arrest, but for a long time we were trying to explain that this indictment was coming, and people didn't believe that was even coming. That was treated as paranoia. His political asylum was treated as paranoia, like that would never even come. So yeah, a whole lot has we've been here for a long time, and a whole lot has changed along the way.
Well, one of the things that I think sitting here with you all is remarkable is the resilience, right? And I think about all the people who we have come across these last 14 years who have been resilient as well. Millions of people. Again, that's not hyperbole, that's not exaggeration. And the thing that kept them afloat, of course, was their beliefs in the principles of free press and free speech, the personal connection to Julian, to Stella, to their family. I mean, what we could see, what we can connect with, but then also too, the information that journalists were giving us, the story you're telling, and the lies that you're exposing. So I want to go to a round of direct questions to each of you. And Chip, we'll start it off with you. In that vein, a lot of us didn't know what the Espionage Act was. What are they charging Julian with? What are the indictments here? And when we started to learn about them, we realized that, okay, this isn't so straightforward. Could you talk to us about the indictments he was facing?
Yeah, I'm going to go through the indictment and what he eventually pled to. Kevin and I have agreed to division of labor, where I will give the dry, pedantic legal facts that will put you to sleep, and then Kevin will give the exciting political analysis that will wake you back up. Matt was too polite to say that, but that is what we actually framed this as behind the scenes. So, Cody, if you could put the briefly up. So Julian Assange was indicted with 18 counts. 17 of those counts were brought under the Espionage Act. One was brought for conspiracy to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. As you can see, I put together a document putting together the charges by document. I'm not going to go through all of them, but if you look here, what you should notice immediately is blatant and grotesque charge stacking. For example, Julian Assange Julian Assange faced 3 charges in addition to the 2 conspiracy charges, 3 charges under the Espionage Act for pure publishing information. These were brought under 793E. Someone without authorized possession of national defense information communicates it. This is the first time in history someone was charged under the Espionage Act for purely publishing. The only offense was he put these documents on the WikiLeaks website. He then faced 4 charges for receiving the information from Chelsea Manning. Of course, you can't publish without receiving. And then the remaining of the charges were these aiding and abetting charges, where Julian Assange was held liable for what Chelsea Manning had done. So Chelsea Manning was charged at the court-martial with violating 793, also giving information. If we could put it back up for 1 second, I'll show people what I'm talking about. Just the State Department cables is fine, Cody. So Chelsea Manning was charged under aiding and abetting for obtaining the documents. This is the State Department cables, but they're all pretty much like this. Then he was charged with aiding and abetting Chelsea Manning, who had lawful possession and unlawfully communicating them to himself. He's guilty for, and let's take a step back, prosecuting a whistleblower for giving information to a journalist is an affront to our democracy. Prosecuting the journalist as being liable for the whistleblower having done so is Kafkaesque. Then he also got another aiding and abetting Chelsea Manning charge. This one, she had unauthorized possession. Remember, in the previous charge, she had lawful possession of these documents. Now she has unauthorized possession, and she unlawfully communicated them. Carrie Shankman has explained to me that you can have lawful and unauthorized possession. I've heard other people say these might be either or charges, but the point is, not only did they hit him twice for Chelsea giving him the documents, they did so like a really contradictory and charge stacking way. So in the final indictment, Julian Assange pled guilty to 793G. That's not up here. And we can take the State Department cables down. And in 793G, what that is that two people or more violated one or more other provisions of the Espionage Act. So Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning were in a criminal conspiracy. The start of the criminal conspiracy, as far as I can tell, is Julian Assange created a website called WikiLeaks that offered to publish military and intelligence information as well as bulk databases. This begins the conspiracy. Chelsea responds and enters the conspiracy. He gives him the documents. Both D and E, the lawful and unauthorized possession, are mentioned, and then Julian Assange is hit for having received them. The one thing that I'm not sure about and is ambiguous, so that the three provisions of the Espionage Act that Manning and Assange conspired to break are C, D, and E. E was both an aiding and abetting charge and the pure publication charge. And E is what Manning was actually convicted of. So it's not clear to me if when they say they conspired to break 793E, this means Manning gave the documents to Assange. It definitely means that. And if it also includes Assange publishing them. I was rereading the plea deal again today, and it does look like it mentions publishing the significant activity reports on the WikiLeaks website, which would be one of the pure publication charges. So I've just thrown out a lot of 793E, 793D, and you're probably thinking, what the hell is he talking about? So I will explain this before turning it over to Kevin, who's going to wake you back up, hopefully. Maybe you're too comatose now. Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange engaged in a criminal conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act. The illegal acts of the conspiracy was Chelsea Manning gave documents to Julian Assange, knowing he might publish them. Julian Assange accepted the documents, and then Julian Assange possibly, I think so, published them. Whistleblower gives journalists war crimes, information about war crimes. Journalist accepts information about war crimes. Journalist publishes them. That is the criminal conspiracy. This is called conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defense information. Kevin, there's another word we usually use for that, isn't there? Matt, you're muted, but take us to Kevin.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, could Cody, could you please play the video first before we jump to Kevin?
At this time, I'm asking you to explain to me, what is it that you did that will constitute the crime charged?
Working as a journalist, I encouraged my source to provide information that was said to be classified in order to publish that information. I believe that the First Amendment protected that activity, but I accept that as written, it's a violation of the Espionage Act statute.
So you had certain belief, but you understand what the law actually says as well.
I believe the First Amendment and the Espionage Act are in contradiction with each other, but I accept that would be difficult to win such a case given all the circumstances.
Okay, Kevin.
Right. So as Chip was laying out, and what we just heard from Julian Assange is he's pleading guilty to journalism. And I'm not claiming that I knew exactly when I titled my book that was what he was going to be able to say, because typically when you plead guilty to an offense in these proceedings, as I've covered several of them, you actually do have to frame it as if you committed a criminal act and use the words that the US government would use in their indictments. This judge was very flexible with Julian Assange and gave him leeway to say that, I believe that what I was doing was what any reporter would do. And that irritated the US government, because if you listen to the recording, there's a part of it where they make it clear to the judge that they do not see this activity as being protected under the First Amendment, and that it is punishable by the Espionage Act, something that we need to chew over throughout this conversation. But as we look at this, I think it's important to make 2 points before we move onward from the proceedings, which is one, that if you look at this plea agreement, and if you also consider the conspiracy at hand, the issue I've always had with it is that it takes away the agency from Chelsea Manning, because what they really want everyone to believe is this falsehood that WikiLeaks went around recruiting people to leak to WikiLeaks. And that's because it has to further this lie that was perpetuated by people like former CIA Director Mike Pompeo to say that this is more like a non-state hostile intelligence service. And so they need you to believe that Chelsea Manning was somehow unearthed and recruited by WikiLeaks, that they found that this person was inside the US military and had access to databases, and that they then were turned against the US government by WikiLeaks because of, as they claim, a most wanted leaks list that was on the internet. The only problem is, I know this from covering Chelsea Manning's court martial, and because it was clearly articulated by Chelsea Manning's attorney, David Coombs, who said, if you look at it and you claim that that's the roadmap for the documents that were selected by Chelsea Manning, you would find that Chelsea Manning actually did a very poor job of being a spy for WikiLeaks, because she didn't grab documents that were on that most wanted leaks list. She grabbed the documents she wanted to release. And so that's just to say that I think it's really unfair here to Chelsea Manning as an Army whistleblower that the government puts her in this position of being a pawn of WikiLeaks when it's her choices. We heard in her own words that she chose to release these materials, having a huge issue and a moral problem with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and what was unfolding, having an issue with the way that diplomats conducted themselves behind closed doors, taking issue with the fact that Barack Obama wanted to close Guantanamo, but here were all these hundreds of detainees still behind prison doors, and they had not been freed, and they were imprisoned or detained on false intelligence. And I'll quickly conclude, because we want to keep the panel moving, by addressing a few parts of the plea deal that are remarkable, which is the fact that as he pled guilty, there's no gag order. There's nothing that says that he can't talk about what happened in these proceedings. But more importantly and more significantly, it says that nothing that he did before this plea deal negotiation can be brought against him. There are no further criminal charges that can be brought against Julian Assange as it relates to CIA hacking materials that were published by WikiLeaks, known as the Vault 7. And he can't ever be criminalized for the publications of the DNC or Clinton campaign emails, which to this day, liberal Democrats can't get over. They have to mention it, even though it has nothing to do with this prosecution. And finally, in court, in that courtroom, the judge, she stated very, very clearly to everyone that was in attendance that the U.S. government had no presumptive victim of these crimes. There was nothing in the plea deal that said that anybody had been injured. Nobody was seeking restitution. And I'll leave it for the later in the panel if we want to go into more and more of the lies that were told about WikiLeaks having blood on their hands. But that was just so critical, because much like what I observed in the Chelsea Manning's court martial, here it was out in the open, no evidence whatsoever that any of these leaks had ever not just killed anybody, but injured anybody, because nobody was seeking restitution from Julian Assange.
Right. I'll note that the Washington Post continues to state these types of lies. Ellen Nakashima's story immediately after the announcement of the plea deal, of the courtroom proceedings, again referenced this notion of like people being harmed. All right. And then even over the weekend, the big story the Post had on the internal deliberations of the Justice Department, why they went along with the plea deal, you continue to see other false stories being repeated, this time, of course, referencing the bogus sexual assault charges put up against Julian Assange. So these lies are something that you all have been struggling against for 14 years now. And Stefania, in Kevin's book, Guilty of Journalism, and in along with Stefania's book, Secret Power, if folks haven't read these, please order them today and read them. But, you know, the subtitle of your book, Stefania, is WikiLeaks and its enemies. And one of the things that you have expressed, you already expressed it today, the courage of Julian Assange, the courage of WikiLeaks, the courage of journalists like yourselves. You all saw what was happening to Julian Assange, and you still stepped forward, as well as others, to defend him, right? But then the price that was paid, of course, obviously by Julian, but by others. So, Stefania, you want to talk for a bit about the courage and the pain, or the price that came along over these last decade and a half?
Yes, of course. Many people tend to believe that this case, the WikiLeaks revolution, was about technology. And of course, technology had a big part on it. Without encryption, without large data sets of classified documents or otherwise restricted documents, it would have been impossible, of course. However, the most important, what really made possible this WikiLeaks revolution was the exceptional courage of Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists. And I have been a witness of this. I have been there. And, you know, I have been a journalist for the last 23 years and 17 in investigative journalism. And I can tell you, I have had the opportunity to have exceptionally important documents, and I was scared. Before publishing some materials, I was thinking about the impact on my life, the life of my family, and whether I had the right to publish and to put them in difficulty, and how it would have an impact on their lives and my lives. And Julian and WikiLeaks, you know, they realized what was the exceptional risk of publishing the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, the cables, especially the cables, and yet they did it. That's the real matter. And by going after them, by persecuting, I would say, not prosecuting, persecuting Julian Assange, the US authority tried to break down, to destroy his exceptional courage by breaking Julian Assange down. So that was the real matter, you know, that was the real matter. Let me add one thing about the victims, because, you know, you think you are talking about the Afghan war logs, Iraq war logs, cables, the Guantanamo documents. I was there. We were publishing in partnership. And I remember the work we did on these documents. And I remember I worked 8 months on cables before they were disseminated without any redaction on the 2nd of September 2011. So I worked 8 months to redact cables. And the reason why they were published without the redaction at the end of the day is because of actions of third parties on which Julian Assange and WikiLeaks had no control whatsoever. But, you know, what is one of the worst campaigns is that about the victims, because after all this work, after we put so much work, and Julian put so much work, and the WikiLeaks journalists put so much work to redact the documents, to make media partnership with people who had a local understanding, who had the understanding of the war on terror, Afghan war, and so on. After all this work, there was this devastating campaign about the blood on their hands. And now, after 14 years, finally, in this plea agreement, we can read that they were unable to identify any victim. Finally, they admit it. And let me tell you one last thing. It was the Obama administration who put Julian Assange WikiLeaks under investigation for the first time. They started it in February 2010. I have the documentation when they started this investigation. I got this documentation through FOI litigation in US, UK, and Sweden, Australia for the last 9 years. So, imagine now, let's focus on this investigation, which was opened by the Obama administration. If the Obama administration had any evidence of any victim, do you think they wouldn't have charged Julian? They never did it. So why they never did it? Because they had no evidence whatsoever. They had no victim whatsoever. They tried hard. They established a massive task force with hundreds intelligence experts, and they found they were unable to find a single victim. And finally, after 14 years, they admitted it in the plea agreement. So that's the real really important thing we should focus on, because this campaign has had a huge impact on the reputation of Julian Assange, on the reputation of their journalistic work. And people keep saying they are not journalists because they just dump stuff on the internet, which is the biggest lies. I was there, the biggest lie we have ever heard. So this is really important. We should keep the focus on this, because they have used this demonization for destroying whatever they have done, basically.
Yep, and they're going to continue to do so. We know that. I mean, to paraphrase, an empire and its wars must be defended by a bodyguard of lies, and that's what you all have been fighting against. It's been remarkable. Yeah. And so, Nathan, I want to ask you. You alluded to this before, but I want you to expand upon it. How did all this work of these journalists tie into the work of the activists?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to see the changes in the perception of Assange over these last 15 years. He had a whole lot of support initially with the 2010, 11, 12 publications. And as alluded to, the 2016 DNC publications invited a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism, and a lot of, the character smears had already started before then, but that really ramped them up. We had to publish many documents debunking various aspects of the whole Russiagate smear. From 2016 to 17, his character was really our focus. We had to undo that work. Basically, we had to correct the record, debunk a lot of these misconceptions. Yeah. And so in 2017, well before he was arrested, we had Lenin Moreno came to power in Ecuador and start to persecute Julian while he was in the embassy, start to criticize him, bogus allegations of bad behavior, cutting his internet, saying he can't make political statements, slowly ratcheting up the pressure, making it clear that he was an unwanted guest as opposed to a political asylee. And so we started a live blog, and throughout 2018, a full year before his arrest, there were near daily updates in the case, just because there were people commenting on this, developments from political leaders, commentary in the media, trying to also explain the importance of WikiLeaks journalism and remind people that the 2010 and 11 stuff is what the government is going after. And so once he finally was arrested, obviously people believed us that this was coming, and the fight was really on. but there was still a lot of work to be done, and it's interesting to track polls over the years. Not enough polling has been done, I think, on American sentiment on this. I'd be really curious to see some post-release polling, but I think that it's gone, his impressions of Assange have really improved over the last several years thanks to the work of activists everywhere, but also the statements from elected officials. So yeah, in 2019, upon his arrest, we started. People in London and New York actually had already been out in the streets every week, activists just kind of sounding the alarm about this, speaking up about it. So I started meeting with fellow anti-war activists, as well as those who were meeting regularly. But groups like Code Pink, Vet for Peace, UNAC, Peace Action, ACLU offshoots, Amnesty offshoots. These are the kind of groups that came together with volunteers who cared about this case and wanted to put their time into it. And so we started to form the Assange Defense, what became the Assange Defense Committee. We grew with branches across the country. Roger Waters came to tour the U.S., and we had tables at every single show, and that really helped us build our network into little cities that we never would have before. Julian's father and brother, John and Gabriel Shipton, came and toured the country, showing their film Ithaca, and that really helped us expand our reach. So it really took a lot of spreading the word and trying to change people's minds first. We felt like we had to kind of lay a foundation of getting people around the country to understand that this is not the person the media is portraying right now. There's a lot more going on here, that these last years of journalism are going on here, and that's what people are reacting to. And so it really took years of trying to build up this kind of institutional and cultural awareness of WikiLeaks' work. There's a young generation, Gen Z, that didn't have, collateral murder as a, formational point in their lives. So we had to kind of re-explain that again. And so it was a lot of that networking and building out this network that I think started to help change the tides. And that gave us a network that could then carry out campaign actions like Paula Ayesela's postcard campaign, or we have Halo Benson in Oklahoma sending out activist kits to, stickers and buttons to others. We have this guy Nathan Williamson in New York floating a balloon in Grand Central, trying to with a message for Free Julian. People got really creative and thought of every possible action they could. I think calling Congress and writing letters to Congress and getting congressional members to sign a letter to the DOJ was really important also. That kind of legitimized us. We had people like Jim McGovern, Thomas Massey speaking out about this, and that really kind of, it was acceptable also once Rashida Tlaib came forward and spoke about that. Rashida Tlaib, I think, was the first one or Ilhan Omar, both of them were among the first to tweet that the prosecution of Assange is indefensible. And that totally legitimized us in the movement. It really made a big difference. And anyway, we built on that. And I won't take up too much time right now, but that was the formation for our network.
You would think after all these years, I'd finally have the unmute thing straight, right? Just anecdotally, just the difference in opinion towards Assange, just the awareness, it's been incredible witnessing that these last, many years. I want to keep us to this idea of this bigger picture of journalism and what this all meant, right? Yeah. So question I have for the group, and just feel free to is, how did Julian Assange and WikiLeaks transform journalism? Go ahead, Chip.
Yeah, I'll be really brief because I know Stefania and Kevin know more about this, but I was reading Stefania's book. I was so moved because she was able to capture for me the moment, what it was like when I first learned about WikiLeaks. And that I think people have really forgotten how exciting, WikiLeaks was when it first burst on the scene. It was because, as Stefania pointed out, they had courage and the technological innovation, but it was really the courage. And it wasn't just that WikiLeaks had courage. It was that so many other people didn't have courage. The collateral murder is 2010. It's not the run up to the Iraq War, but we all remembered how so many people in the media acted as stenographers when Bush and Cheney wanted to launch that war of aggression into Iraq. And I remember listening in my car. I think Kevin wrote about this. I think, Nathan, you probably had a role in this. The Winter Soldier hearings, where the Iraq veterans would come forward and talk. And I actually met one of the veterans who was in the collateral murder video, the one who saves a child's life. I think, Kevin, you filmed him. And it was just like all of these people who had been trying to tell us what was going on, and the media was ignoring them. And we had a media that was willing to tell lies. James Risen very famously discovered the NSA was wiretapping U.S. citizens. New York Times killed the story for 1 year. They didn't want to publish it because the Bush administration asked them not to. They only publish it because he's going to scoop them in his book. So we had a very cowardly media. It was not the media of I.F. Stone. It was the media of Judith Miller. And I will say that we're back in that situation again, where we see the media parroting these lies about the genocide in Gaza, where we see really, once again, a war, this time a genocide being made by lies, and that the corporate media is acting as stenographers. And something people keep asking me when I've been doing this is, do any of these revelations matter? Does anyone actually pay attention to them? And what I say is that the governments of the world fear the truth. If the US government didn't fear the truth, they wouldn't have spent 14 years torturing, contemplating killing, and just otherwise destroying Assange and WikiLeaks. If the Israeli government didn't fear the truth, they wouldn't be shutting down Al Jazeera. They wouldn't be assassinating journalists. They wouldn't be getting our Congress to ban TikTok. Our Congress want to ban TikTok already, but we have this great synergy when, our own national security hawks want to do something, and one of our great allies also wants to do it. It gets done really quickly. And that we cannot be cynical about the power of truths. If government is this willing to go to these lengths to wipe it out, it clearly still has meaning. And WikiLeaks captured that. And it gave me my faith in the power of the truth.
Kevin, Stefania?
Well, go ahead, Stefania. I want Stefania to speak first.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt this has been, I think, the most important revolution in the history of journalism, because they didn't just reveal classified documents, because the national security journalists do this quite often, I would say. They won the war against state secrecy. That's why the US authorities wanted to destroy Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. They didn't give a man a fish. They basically, they provided a way. They made people realize that the war against secrecy could be won, and they did. And so the national security state, what I call the secret power, the highest level of power, was terrified. They were assuming the state secrecy was, forever, was going ahead forever. And they realized they were absolutely, they were absolutely at risk, the risk of losing control of their secrets. This made them mad, mad. They have a lot of dirty secrets. It was not just about revealing some classified documents, as the national security journalists do at the New York Times or Washington Post, with many negotiations with the national security state and US authorities, like Chief Gibbons, who was telling us about the James Risen revelations. No, there had been negotiation between the New York Times, don't publish now, let's see. And James Risen had to scoop them by publishing his own book, So it was not like this. WikiLeaks didn't want this kind of compromise, didn't want this kind of negotiation. They had exceptional courage, and they took the heat. And of course, the national security state was terrified. Let me tell you, I come from a country where we have had a long history of violence. red brigades, fascists putting bombs in the trains and killing hundreds of people, and the families are still looking for justice. And we never, WikiLeaks and we media partners were revealing some data sets. These families were reaching me out and they were asking, could you please check whether there is anything about our case? Why? Because they realize there is no way to challenge this state secrecy using the traditional channels, prosecutors and the usual channels, FOI requests and so on. There is no way. So that's why what I call the secret power one is upset about Julian and WikiLeaks, because they want this big fight against state secrecy. And the revolution has been amazing. It has been copied by many. Let's not forget that their model of journalism had been copied by many. Let's not forget, the Panama Papers and scoops like that. It was copied by many, but no one had the courage to do what they did. And in fact, we haven't seen the same persecution for the Panama Papers and for the other big scoops in the history of journalism. We haven't seen, this large access by the ordinary people to this extremely valuable information. They publish revelations, but they don't publish the original documents as WikiLeaks has always done. And by publishing these original documents, they have empowered large communities, scholars, activists, journalists around the world. This has been a massive revolution.
Right. I mean, that's a huge, it still occurs where you have outlets that have the ability to link to the source documents as part of their story, and they refuse to do so. How many times we see that, just say even on a court proceeding, where the court filing or the court or what the court renders could be linked to, and you can include that in the story, but they refuse to do so because they want you to go through their filter. Kevin, I know you have thoughts on how Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have changed journalism.
Yeah, and I know we're coming up on our hour mark, but if people are able, this is such a good conversation, I'd like to extend it for some additional minutes.
As long as you all are able to. And I knew there was no way we were be able to do this in an hour. I mean, like I said earlier, I couldn't do this with each of you for 1 hour, let alone the whole group. I mean, so please, go on.
At least let us all come back. At least let us all come back around for some closing remarks here after we get to hit the important journalism questions. But I was thinking, the U.S. government, the secret power that Stefania so clearly articulated. I wanted her to speak before me because I didn't partner with WikiLeaks. She actually knows firsthand how WikiLeaks was revolutionizing journalism. She was part of that revolution in some respect. I just benefited from it. But I think that the U.S. intelligence agencies, they don't really fear what's leaked today. They fear the next leak, because they fear what they don't know. They don't know what's going to be coming that's going to impact them. And WikiLeaks presented the possibility that there would be this outpost forever, or at least indefinitely, that would provide people a resource for challenging the abuses of power by the United States. And I just want to turn to this thing that I've been grappling with, which is, I kind of like it that there are those in what I'll call the prestige media, the legacy or traditional media, that aren't as celebratory as we are, because they don't have this affinity or solidarity with Julian Assange, but instead are, now that it's all said and done, pronouncing in their pages that this is a chilling precedent for journalism. Right. And where was the articulation unequivocally before this? It's going to sound like I'm picking on him. I kind of am. But Charlie Savage authored this article about this being a chilling precedent. And he wrote, I have this here, that it is bad for American press freedoms. He's not wrong. The agreement means that for the first time in American history, gathering and publishing information the government considers secret has been successfully treated as a crime. That's sort of what Chip said earlier. He's not wrong. But then he writes that people who are journalists might be chilled in how aggressively they do their jobs. But as you heard from Chip and as you've heard from Stefania, they were chilled or they weren't doing their jobs before they were attacked by the government. So what does it mean now that they tell us that they are upset by this precedent when they sit on stories about Saudi secret drone bases that they don't publish? When they know the identity of somebody like Raymond Davis in Pakistan, who creates this huge uproar and scandal for the Obama administration in Pakistan, it turns out he's working for the CIA. He's not just some like random contractor that happened to be caught up in some issue. And they're telling us lies, and they're sitting on stories that unravel these lies. And then they say leave some stories unreported out of fear that they might be prosecuted. No, leave some stories unreported because you identify with the US government so much that you don't feel like sharing these stories with us. That you are, I cannot stand how many articles have said, and this was what the New York Times did, that Julian Assange timed the releases of the DNC and Clinton campaign emails so that they could hurt the Democrats in 2016. No. He did what every editor of any respectable news media organization would do. He published those materials when he knew they would have the most political impact so that they could have the widest reach and so that they could affect a political outcome. That is what journalism should do. It empowers us to create change. And the fact that there are so many people at the New York Times and beyond that are reticent to see their work as an extension of promoting human rights and justice, which should be universal principles, that is something that they need to confront within themselves. I'll just close because we believe, based on the reporting that has come from the Washington Post, as well as a very sloppy and shoddy piece of reporting by the New York Times, that the First Amendment question, that they were going to have an appeal hearing on this First Amendment question, is a big part of why we got this plea deal in the Assange case. And people should just reflect on how that First Amendment issue is what led us to this point. And the fact that they aren't exercising their First Amendment rights to the fullest every single day, but Julian Assange was, even though he doesn't have First Amendment rights according to our U.S. Supreme Court. I don't know. I think there's a lot that they need to grapple with. Not me, Stefania, Chip, Matthew, Nathan. We've all been addressing these questions for the last 5 to 14 years. But some of these people today are just waking up to the world that is the post-Assange guilty plea.
You know, I saw someone else say that the people who benefited the most from this decision in terms of who has been strengthened in all this are the lawyers that these media outlets employ, right? So now everything has to go through the lawyers. I mean, it did before, but now everything is because you have this precedent. And I know there's a distinction between a precedent and a plea, how it's not really a precedent and a precedent decided by a court. I understand all that, but you have this now where, okay, lawyers are really going to have to vet everything at these mainstream places, and they're going to do it to protect themselves and give up that First Amendment right that they have. And Nathan, do you have anything you want to add about this, how Julian and WikiLeaks have transformed journalism and media?
Yeah, and that those lawyers are only going to further provide excuses to hold things up and continue. That's the way things go. No, but I mean, you guys have all spoken really well about how WikiLeaks has changed journalism. We've all seen the Washington Post secure drop page where they say they actively encourage, if you have any classified documents, please send them to us if they're in the public interest. So whether they want to admit it or not, this, the way Assange has executed his journalism has completely changed the way everyone else has had to do theirs. I appreciate you guys laying it out the way that you have.
You know, one of the things I was thinking of as you all are discussing how things have changed is the first time I ever publicly commented on WikiLeaks was April of 2010 for the collateral murder video. Myself and another veteran, we were on MSNBC and we were asked what do you think of this? What do you think of this video being shown? And both of our responses were, why are people shocked? What did you think we were doing in Iraq for the last 6.5 years? It gets this idea of exposing the truth, letting people know what's actually occurring. This is a question I wanted to ask you all too, because I feel that you all we've seen some of it already. So we've hit on Charlie Savage, we've hit on Ellen Nakashima, we've hit on some of the organizations, some of the folks, people who've been working so hard. But in terms of, in this moment, who should we be recognizing? One or two people each, positive, negative, however you want to do this, give you a chance to vent, give you a chance to celebrate somebody, give you a chance to recognize somebody in this moment. Who should we be recognizing for their role in these last 14 years, either the good or the bad?
I want to give a huge shout out to the Progressive International for organizing the Belmarsh Tribunal and for holding it in Washington, D.C. When they told me they were going to do an event in D.C. about Julian Assange at the National Press Club, I was like, okay, no one will come. I was wrong. And they had a full house. They had members, they had congressional staff there. That event directly led to the situation where we had a member of Congress lead on this issue. I can't say a lot about closed door things, but I was at the meeting where Tlaib agreed to finally, not just finally speak out on Assange, but to lead the letter. I mean, there were other people who had made comments, but Nathan knows this, and I'll say this publicly. We had a letter ready to go. And we went to all of the people who were making comments, and not a single one of them wanted to lead the letter. And it went on for, was it 2 years, Nathan, 3 years of trying to find anyone in the House willing to lead a letter on this. And after the Belmarsh, actually it might have been the day before but it was part of the Belmarsh Tribunal entourage. I don't want to say who else was in the meeting. I might get people in trouble. But you would know who they were. We set it up, and she agreed to do it. And it was a fantastic moment, and that was game changing. So I really want to thank the Progressive International for doing that. I want to thank Shreshko and David Adler for putting that together, Michael Gallant. I want to thank Jeremy Corbyn, especially want to thank Jeremy Corbyn and Stephen Donziger and Amy Goodman for coming to it, because those were three names that pushed people on the Hill who were on the left but had heard all those smears about Julian Assange. They saw Corbyn and Amy Goodman and Stephen Donziger, and Stephen Donziger was very popular for the Congressional Progressive Caucus. When they heard those voices, it moved people. And I still will be walking around the Hill sometimes, and people will pop out and say, "Oh, you were at that event with Corbyn and Donziger." It's like, oh, great.
Well, that idea of courage, of being willing to stand up to the smears, knowing the risks that will come to you. And certainly in a town like Washington, D.C., if you're not loyal, right, if you're willing to go against what the narrative is, that can be very harmful for your career, right?
I was the only person from D.C. who spoke on that panel, I think. And I got this introduction being like, surprise, one, because they tried to find anyone. The introduction that they played on the mock, I was like, surprise, there's a person in D.C. who'll talk about Julian Assange, other than send him to Gitmo. And, it was, I don't get invited to many dinner parties. So, who cares?
Well, which is, that's a whole other aspect of journalism we haven't even addressed, this idea of access journalism, right? This is the idea of making sure you're on the White House Christmas card list. But Kevin, Stefania, Nathan, people, organizations you want to, single out, recognize, in this moment?
I mean, I definitely want to just shout out Stella Assange, who has been just an incredible advocate. And I hope somebody has a negative person they want to talk about too. But I'll talk about the positive that Stella has brought to this, because it's really been just incredible to see what she's had to go through. I mean, having the global scrutiny and global criticism and so many eyes on her, doing every possible interview, keeping on message, staying clear, no matter if it was left or right, she would take it and do it. And she had just incredible poise throughout. She was if the light that we looked to if we were ever unsure where to go on the message. So I just really appreciate her guidance. And Stella Assange, very impressive. And I'm so happy that she gets to relax now and not do this for a little bit.
But yeah, I mean, nothing. The only thing I can say about Stella is just bless her. Bless her. Kevin, you've put it out a little chat here that you're going to step up with a negative person.
Yeah, but let me do a little bit of positive before we get going, because this is about journalism. So I was thinking of people like Consortium News and that group that had done a lot to get around. I was part of a kind of journalist roundtable last week that Stefania unfortunately was invited, couldn't join, but we had a bunch of people who had been journalists who had covered the proceedings. My colleague, Mohammed Almazi, really just doing a lot of the footwork. I mean, he was my lifeline because in the last few months, they made this arbitrary decision in the Administrative Courts Office of the UK that they weren't going to allow remote observation of the proceedings. You could not have a video link anymore. And the reason was because I could not be held in contempt of court and jailed since I am in the United States. I would not be in England and Wales, so they could not actually put me in cuffs and enforce their court rules. So I thank him for being there to help me continue the dissenter coverage. There's shows that I can think of off the top of my head that had me on that don't normally, they defied the culture of the press, which is to mostly overlook this story. I mean, even when you extend it out to progressive media, there wasn't always a lot of regular attention to this case, but places like Breakthrough News, there's this guy named Jordan Cheriton at Status Quo who always had me on. And then even people who are kind of like outside of the spectrum of what's considered acceptable media, but I would be invited to go do Lee Camp, or I would be invited to talk to a lot of different people's shows that Scott Horton, I need to thank Scott Horton of Anti-War Radio, who, had me on for probably the 25th time. The negative person I want to share, which I think we can all really appreciate how awful this is I have this up here. I want to, there was an appearance on CNN that David Sanger did. And the only reason you might know that this happened is because James Clapper came on TV and he said that he thought that Assange had paid his dues, and that got most of the attention. Well, I feel like that's a different discussion for another day. What this is, the spin that the U.S. security state has been putting on this. I want to focus on the journalism thing that David Sanger said that was absolutely atrocious, where he drew this distinction. He said it was Private Manning who had made these. David Sanger is at the New York Times, and David Sanger is an important figure for me because he was my example for Democrats of why they should care about this case. Because I constantly told them that if Donald Trump had another term in office, this was probably someone who would be on an enemies list and could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for the kind of national security journalism he's done to go after Donald Trump and his cronies. So he said on CNN, it was Private Manning who made these commitments to keep all of the things secret. It was different and more complicated for Assange. He's not a U.S. government employee. He had never made commitments to do that. He wasn't a U.S. citizen. Again, this is all true, just like what I did with Charlie Savage. He's not wrong. But here's where I have an issue. He also wasn't a journalist. He was taking this data and just throwing everything out there because WikiLeaks had this sort of anarchic concept of full transparency. He didn't do what I think you and I would consider what journalists do: sift through the material, figure out what's important, exercise some judgment about what you publish and what you don't, excise the names of people whose lives could be at risk. Those are all things that we and other news organizations went and did. And I just hiss with the most uncontrollable rage at that sort of sentiment. And there's a lot that can be